My name is Brittney-Nichole Connor-Savarda, and I am the founder of Catalyst for Change LLC and Emotional Intelligence Magazine Plus. So in a nutshell, I teach individuals how to liberate themselves from themselves, and organizations how to drill down to the root of their people problems to help them avoid costly mistakes while also improving the well-being and the performance of their employees. So I do this through developing awareness and emotional intelligence, but on a level that is not often discussed and practiced. And we're going to talk about some of those things that aren't often discussed and practiced in this session today. But first, I want to introduce to you my friend, colleague, and partner in crime for this session, Bob Borcherdt. So Bob, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany. Great to be with you today, and also great to see so many familiar faces on the call. I see some of the IN2GREAT team out there. So I'm Bob Borcherdt. I founded IN2GREAT in 2011, and really, I was one of those people that started a company without a vision. The only thing I had was I knew I was really passionate about people, and much like you, Brittany, I just wanted to see people inspired and equipped to be everything they were created to be. And like you said so well, we just get locked down in ourselves a lot of the time. So I had no idea what that was going to look like. And now, almost 11 years later, the company has morphed into something I could have never imagined. We now have a team of 7 people. We've moved to the Charlotte area, as you know, to expand our geography and our reach. And it's been interesting moving to a place where we know nobody. And actually, one of the first people we met is on this call, and he introduced us to you. And so I know there's some of our team on here today. We're thrilled to be part of this and really excited to share some of the things that we're learning because a lot has changed. There was a lot changing before COVID, and then COVID became this catalyst that just raised awareness of a lot of things that were going on in the workplace.
Yeah. So I'm assuming for those of you on this call, you are here today because either one, you're facing people problems in your organization, or you're a member of the Bob Borcherdt fan club. But regardless of which one of those, or maybe both of those, you are, we hope that you'll be able to walk away from this conversation feeling hopeful and eager to take the next steps to solve your organization's people problems, whatever that may look like for you. So Bob, you just talked about COVID, so I'm going to kind of elaborate on that a bit. It did teach us a lot. And I know this is a subject that I'm sure we are all tired of talking about. I'm speaking for myself, but I think a lot of people feel that way. However, the consequences of COVID allowed us to see just how critical our mental health is in determining both individual and organizational success and well-being, and how many things can go wrong when we aren't in a good space. And that can be physically, mentally, or spiritually. So when I would tell leaders pre-COVID that all your organizational problems are directly tied to people problems, they would give me that I call BS look that kind of looks like this, right? I'm sure you've got some of those looks before. And especially if they are in the information technology world, and no offense to anybody in that space, but it's true. All of our organizational problems can be tied back to people, whether it's a bug in the code, a delayed release, shipping issues. It really doesn't matter. As long as there's people involved, they are a source of our organizational problems. How many times have you known a project to be extended for ridiculous amounts of time because people couldn't come together to make a decision, or someone intentionally stalled things because they had a personal vendetta against the project manager that they were working with, right? It happens all the time. There's always examples of these things. And what we usually do is we throw it off on other reasons outside of ourselves or outside of other people-related issues, right? Bob, what have you seen to be some of the examples where it's a people problem, but people are often calling it something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point, Brittany. And, one of the interesting things that we find, and we say this a lot in our work with clients, is that the greatest source of frustration is an unmet expectation. And so when you think about the expectations that all of us are placing on each other, we're just talking about the workplace today. We could talk outside the workplace for hours of what that looks like just in relationships and everything else. But most of the time, those expectations go uncommunicated and they don't go followed up on.
Mm-hmm.
And so you said earlier, this getting stuck in ourselves thing, right? What we see in the people space, and our whole focus is on people. Our unique approach to it is we focus on data, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But what we see is this interaction, first and foremost, between me and myself is a critical issue. And most leaders, if we're honest, don't have any training in that.
Yeah.
Like, how do I help get unstuck? But then if you go to, now I have this group of employees that I'm responsible for, they've all got their interactions with themselves personally, with each other, and with me. And in the space of all these interactions, there's this lack of training on how to really handle all of that and deal with all of that. And that's really where the crux of the problems really sit, is we just don't have a language for it. We don't know how to have the conversations that are really productive. And so we use a statement, we say data, not drama, because most of the time dealing with those interactions, even personally, my own conversation in my own head can lead to drama. But when we're in communication with other people and trying to understand those expectations, we just don't have a way to talk about it very effectively. And that's one of the things that we're really pushing hard to change.
And we know that we have these problems, right? Like, it's very clear and apparent. I don't think any leader will deny that we have these issues in our organization. But still, there are some leaders who refuse to do what it takes to solve them. And in many cases, just acknowledge them to begin with, right? Like, they want to, as I said before, pawn it off on something else. What too often happens is leaders do what is necessary to, I don't know if appease is the right word, but appease their employees, right? They say, this is a big issue. You're right. We need to solve this. And so they start throwing things at it like, let's bring in a speaker. Let's do a workshop. Let's do this team building activity. Let's do this training, whatever it may be. But what happens? They often fall flat, right? So now the leader says, oh, I knew this soft stuff was BS. And they refuse to invest in what truly is going to solve for those problems, because they put a Band-Aid on a gash that is hemorrhaging. And I apologize. I know that's probably not the best thing to say around lunchtime if you guys are like eating and I'm talking about gashes and hemorrhages. But the point being, that's what we do, is we put Band-Aids on really big problems. And then we say, I knew that that wasn't going to fix it. And I'm sure that you are aware, this is the whole epitome of quick fixes, right? And the word fix should just be taken out, because it's not a fix. It's more of a temporary pain reliever. And as a facilitator myself, because that's how I started my business, it was really hard for me to accept that workshops don't solve people problems. They inform, which is important. That's an important component. In order to transform, you need that information first, but it typically stops there. And here are a few other reasons why quick fixes don't work. And I'm sure those of you who are on this session probably already know this, but I'm just going to reiterate it and kind of dive a little bit deeper. First is a lack of follow through, which Bob, you just mentioned. Follow through is so crucial. You can't do anything without follow through. Like, you can't expect to build a professional athlete by sending your child to one training camp. It just doesn't work that way. It has to be continuous practice. Also, know-how. We don't know what we don't know. I'm really just reiterating everything that you just said. Another thing that I think is huge is intention. What intent does this leader have by bringing someone in to talk about these pain points? Is it because they're seeing a shift in their bottom line? They're seeing things change on their P&L and they want to solve that. So they're not doing it with the intent of really helping their employees. They're doing it with the intent of, I need to make my stakeholders happy. We need to see, some changes in our digits. But if they don't have the intent, then they're not going to put in the time and the energy and resources, because it takes time, energy, and resources, which leads to the next thing, and that is commitment. They have no clue how complicated these problems are. And so once they kind of put their toes in the water and realize how ice cold it is, instead of just diving in, they step out, right? And so what ends up happening is they treat the symptoms instead of treating the root of the problem, because it makes them feel better for doing something, and it alleviates that pain just a little bit, but it doesn't actually take care of it. And you're ending up putting more time and energy into it. It's no different than disciplining a kid. You can yell at a kid and they might stop what they're doing right in that moment, but then they're probably going to do it again and again and again if you don't have that built in, this is the expectation kind of thing. A little bit different, but kind of the same concept, right? So, Bob, can you elaborate a little bit, on how do we differentiate from symptoms of people problems versus identifying for the root cause?
Yeah, and so to dive into that, I mean, obviously that's a multi-level type of conversation, but at the very surface of that, I think one of the big problems we see on our team is leaders have bought into a false order of priorities. So in essence, most leaders today believe that their primary job is to get results. Then underneath that is take care of their team, and underneath that is take care of themselves. And unfortunately, that's the wrong order. The order should flip, and their first priority should be to take care of themselves, because an unhealthy leader can't lead a team, right? Unhealthy leader, unhealthy team most of the time. So they have to carve out time for themselves. Then they have to carve out time for their team. And then the results has to be the third priority. And actually, if they do 1 and 2 really well, they'll begin to build a machine that will just produce results. But they're afraid to take the leap because of time, because of resources, because of commitment. I know the IN2GREAT people that are on this call, if we had $5 for every time somebody told us, well, we just don't have time to do that, we could just make a business out of that. And in reality, what they're really saying is, no, we have time. That's just not a high priority.
Right.
And until leaders begin to understand that that priority shift has to happen, we're just going to keep putting Band-Aids on stuff. And then Brittany, the second thing that we see, which is just as interesting, is I think oftentimes the leaders in this scenario take the bad rap. Okay. And for, like you said earlier, some of it's know-how. Sometimes, like, we have CEOs that will look us in the eyes and go, can you help? Like, I don't know how to do this. That's rare. They're probably not going to admit that publicly, but a lot of times leaders will say, I just don't know how. It's oftentimes not as much I don't want to, it's I don't know how to, I don't have the time to, and I have to make this priority switch. And I'm not sure I have the energy to even do it, to stick with it long enough, or the support from somebody above me. The other component in this whole thing, so that we don't just put the blame on the leader, and we see this, and you've probably seen it in some of your facilitation work, is let's talk about the employees. Are the employees as committed? Are they willing to engage in this process? Are they in the process of developing themselves? Are they somebody that will respect the authority and the leadership of the person they're reporting to? A lot of times, I'd love to ask Gallup this question. Have they ever asked exiting employees, were they the problem? Most of the time, all of the questions are something else other than that, but I've never ever seen on Gallup exit interviews, hey, could you be honest with us? Were you actually the reason why you left? Most of the time, they blame it on the boss. So we've got this two-way thing, right? We've got this leader who has to be willing to invest in him or herself and the team. And we have to have a team member who's willing to do the same thing and kind of roll up their sleeves and invest in this, because they're going to have to do work with their peers. They're going to have to do work with their leader. I would say we see just as many employees not willing to engage in that as we do leaders. And so somehow that conversation has to be more prevalent, because you're right, we're going to continue to just try and solve things that are really just on the surface. Another thing that we see happening in the leadership development space, and that is we put a disproportionate amount of emphasis on content and not context. So when we train and teach in these classroom-like settings, it's a giant content push. The problem is none of us learn outside of a context. Right? If we don't understand the context even of a sentence, we don't know the meaning of the sentence. If I say to you, Brittany, my wife is hot, without any other information, do you know whether she has a fever, she's angry with me, or she's beautiful? Now, she's beautiful, and thankfully she's not angry with me or has a fever. But again, I just gave you content, but no context. Yeah. And so this whole leadership development thing is shifting, even while we speak, it is shifting to a totally different format where it has to happen on the job, in the flow of work, and it has to be leader-led, okay? Because all that learning has to happen in context. You may go to a class to learn something, but the application of it, the follow-through that you mentioned that's lacking, is really gonna happen a different way. And then the last thing I'll say this is we oftentimes teach these things in a vacuum as if they apply to everybody the same way.
Yeah.
And they really don't. Each one of us is wired very, very differently. And so we receive the information differently, we apply the information differently. And oftentimes when the gurus write their books, they just talk about this thing and like everybody should adopt this. Well, maybe so, but how somebody gets to adopting that's going to look very, very different based on their individual circumstances. So again, to the time it takes to really understand that as a leader and help your people navigate that becomes really challenging. And then lastly, I'll just say this, if you want a really good example of symptom versus root cause, how many years and how many millions of dollars have we spent doing engagement surveys? And what do we know? We have very low engagement, and we keep measuring it and we keep measuring it and we keep engagement is a symptom. It's not a root cause. At the root of engagement is a lack of fulfillment. If a human being isn't fulfilled personally and in what they're doing, and if they can't find meaning in their work, if they don't connect well with their leader or their team or the organization or even the role that they're in, they're never going to be fulfilled. Because if you think about it, those moments, Brittany, when you've been fulfilled in something you're doing, are you engaged?
Yeah.
Absolutely. You cannot be fulfilled and not engaged. But we want to do all this stuff to help engagement. So if we bring in ping pong tables and nap pods and we paint the lunchroom this color and we do all these different things, our people will be engaged. Well, that's proven now to not work.
Right.
And again, we're not looking at the root cause, which we believe in Integrate is fulfillment. Leaders have to help their people navigate their way to fulfillment. And that may mean it's not inside their organization.
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought up the point that as an individual employee, people need to focus on themselves. And like you said, not just the leader, because it's kind of like, the child, I don't know why I keep using this child parenting. You could even use it with spouses, friends, right? Roommates. It doesn't really matter. We always see it as the other person is the problem.
That's
they
right.
made me do this. They made me feel this way. If it wasn't for blah, blah, blah. And while other people can influence our behavior, make it more challenging to accomplish things, at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing or not doing that is hindering our growth or perpetuating a problem? Because if you are not having those conversations that need to be had, then a lot of things are festering under the surface, and then they just erupt in all these consequences, whether that's a falling out with a leader or another coworker, or holding information back because you want to make it more challenging for someone else on your team. And then that affects deadlines and customer satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It just snowballs, right? Mm-hmm. And people problems are complex. And don't get me wrong, I know a lot of people who, and I myself have gotten certifications that took a couple days to get certified. However, that isn't giving you the depth of knowledge you need to truly start to solve these at a deeper level. It's a great start, right? And I think a lot of people are going into these organizations with a higher level of understanding that just isn't penetrating to the level that this virus, if you'll call it, right, of people problems has spread. And that's not a hit on anyone doing this. It's just, if we really want to solve this, we really need that expertise. And that's why I'm kind of opposed to these one-off workshops and training the trainer, because at a certain point, yes, you can train a trainer to do a certain amount of things, but it doesn't address the nuance and complexity and all the multitude of factors that are going to present themselves, right? Skill sets, personalities, experiences, what people have going on in their home life, all their insecurities. How do you talk to someone? I think many people can relate to feeling like they're walking on eggshells, or they're afraid to bring up anything, even if it's positive feedback for that person to help them grow. They're afraid that that's going to be taken as criticism, and just don't even have that open dialogue for fear of the consequences, right? So I know that you and I have talked about this, and I want to bring this up because I have this new program that you and I discussed it's called CONVOshop, and it's conversation first. We have to start having conversation. We have to open it up to dialogue, and we have to be able to deconstruct to reconstruct. Because until we deconstruct all of these beliefs, these conditions, indoctrinations that we have been told, if we manage in said way, if we react in a certain way, we can and can't feel or shouldn't do certain things. If we still have that script running in our head, almost anything we do isn't going to be effective, because that script is going to prevent us from implementing all of these wonderful strategies and techniques and the information that we've been provided, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you have those difficult conversations? How do you get people to open up and have that dialogue in your work?
Yeah, and that's an interesting topic. And so one of the things we do at IN2GREAT is we use data to help with that. And that data looks like behavioral data that we call your behavioral DNA. It's your hardwiring. It looks like your cognitive ability. We get into mental maps, which are these filters in people's heads. And because we really don't see anything with our eyes and hear anything with our ears, do we? All of that stuff, light is transmitted, sound is transmitted, and we interpret through filters in our brain. Well, if we don't understand that about another person, and if we don't know the filters that they use, it's really hard to understand how we're going to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. So the data, even the behavioral and the cognitive data, helps us understand how to have the conversation the right way. Because again, we don't all communicate the same way. We don't always give and receive information in the same manner. Some people are highly susceptible to anything that even looks like criticism, whereas other people can handle it very differently. I think the shift, Brittney, that we're talking about is not that training is bad. It's not. It's the type of training we're doing and who we're doing it with, right? Yeah. So our belief is that training has to shift to leaders, managers, and supervisors at all levels in an organization. And we have to start teaching them these things so that they know how to understand people. And we want them to get deep into how they do that, not just at the surface level, and how to have those conversations. We believe everything is coming back to the one-on-one conversation in one-on-one meetings. And this remote movement's going to create some challenges for it, because we're going to have to figure out how to do that. But it's all coming down to that very place. We call it leading to the one in our organization, okay? I have 4 sons. Being a dad wasn't difficult. You know, it was really hard being 4 different dads to 4 different sons who were very different. That was the most difficult part. And if you've ever had children, you know what that means, any of you on the call. Leadership is the same way. I can't lead one way and expect that that's going to work for everybody. So I'm going to have to learn how to have conversations with people that are very different than me. So isn't it ironic, a couple things that are going on in society right now, in a time where we all know on this call that these conversations have to happen? What are we having difficulty having in our country? Civil conversations.
Yeah.
Right? Everything has become so polarized that we can't even engage in conversation if they don't believe exactly the same way we do. It's never been as bad as it is right now, right? So we know that this has to happen, these conversations, but the forces at play are making it harder to do that. And then the second thing, I am not an expert in AI, so please, nobody on this call misinterpret what I'm about to say, but I have been interested in, whether you agree with Elon Musk or not, his position on AI, because if you think about this, Brittany, one of the solutions to the people problem is artificial intelligence. Okay, so we can't fix the people problem because it's too complex and too complicated. So we'll solve it a different way, and we'll create a whole new technology that will actually make us less dependent on people. And that's where Elon Musk's going, hey, hang on a minute here, like think this thing through where this could end up if we do that. So we're saying, no, we have to go old school. We have to go back to people, and we have to go back to the one-on-one in really engaging them at a different level. And then the last thing I'll say too is in our company, we spend a lot of time helping our clients understand the difference between what is complex and what is complicated. Things that are complicated can be solved. Things that are complex can be navigated. And everybody has a different level of ability to deal with something on that spectrum, from complicated to complex. Some people are wired to deal with more complex things, other people aren't. So when you look at the human being, what are those things that we're talking about that are complicated that we might be able to solve? And what are those things that are complex that if we try and solve them, we're going to spend a lot of energy trying to solve things that can only be navigated? So hopefully that makes sense in understanding the difference and identifying the difference between the two. But we're really trying to help. We have seen leaders develop tremendous fatigue in the last 2 years trying to solve things that are complex that can only be navigated. If you owned a business of 300 employees, you did not have the right to solve COVID. You only had the opportunity to navigate it. And that's the difference between the two.
I think the challenge for many people is navigating themselves first.
Yes.
I mean, we keep going back to this, but I don't think you can harp on it enough, because we're always trying to solve other people's problems or telling them the problems that they need to solve, but we don't start with ourselves. And if we all just did that, that in and of itself, just developing awareness alone would solve a lot of the issues that we're facing today.
That's right.
It's just very challenging because again, the scripts that we've been running makes us feel bad for self-reflecting and pulling everything out and exposing all of our quote unquote mistakes, flaws, things that we need to work on, because we assume that that's part of our identity and our self-worth, and it's not. And that's one of the things that I work on first, whether it's with an individual or with a team, is saying all of these things that you have labeled as being bad or XYZ, we've got to strip all of that and reconstruct that. And then another important thing is control. So I teach them how to influence other people, right? Learn to control yourself, learn to influence others. But as long as we keep trying to control other people, we're never going to see any progress or change. So you and I were introduced by the wonderful Chuck Cooper, who is on the call today. And the reason that you and I connected is because what we do weaves in to each other really well, right? It complements, our services complement one another. You focus heavily on the data. And for me, I focus heavily on all the messy stuff that the data doesn't always give us, right? Like the data is never going to tell you that someone's family member just passed away from an illness or they're going through a divorce, right? There's all these subtleties and nuances to what make us who we are that data will never be able to manage. And so how do we learn how to tweak those things to help us better communicate things when there may be extra resistance, extra hesitation, there may be fear under the surface that is preventing someone from moving past that and living up to their full potential?
Yeah. And so what we do is I would say that we use data as a catalyst to get to that place where sometimes people aren't willing to go. If we just open up the conversation and say, hey, let's talk about this, right? So oftentimes as we work with leaders and helping them understand why they show up the certain ways that they do. We had a fascinating conversation with a high school principal who said to us on a call, look, I need to be honest with you, I hate graduation parties. And we were able to show him in his data why that is and give him permission to stop beating himself up for it, right? So the data helped uncover something and reveal that. One of our team members just recently had a member that he was working with. She said, since I've been working with you, I haven't had chest pains in the last 2 weeks, because I'm starting to understand things differently and I'm starting to understand myself in a different way. And so we get to the same place, we get there a little bit differently. And oftentimes we find that because the data is more sterile, people will begin to engage in those conversations with us to get there.
Yeah.
But at the end, we have the same goal in mind. And that is to really help these people get unstuck and see them really develop into a fuller version of themselves.
How do you manage, you had mentioned the excuses that people have as far as I don't have the time or energy, which I think the energy is a very valid point. Many people are facing burnout. They have so much on their plate. And while they may be able to make time, the energy isn't there. Do you have any strategies to kind of help them navigate that energy?
Yeah, that's a really great point and a great question. And I would say we're beginning to uncover some of those things, because what we're finding is to really start any of that, people have to be willing to make some hard decisions. And there's some things they're probably going to have to stop doing that are consuming their time, or they're going to have to invest for a period of time to get ahead of the thing so that they're not working on the symptoms and they're really getting into the root causes. And our concern is really the energy level of people and the fatigue that COVID took a lot out of people physically, mentally. You mentioned it earlier, emotionally. I mean, people are tired. They're weary still from all of that and what it did. And I think there's going to be a season where there's going to have to be some healing happen in a lot of people, and they're going to have to restore some energy and take some time off. We have one leader who instituted a policy and is requiring every one of his senior leadership members to take 1 week off. They get paid, but it doesn't go against their vacation. Their company email gets disconnected. They're not allowed to take any equipment with them. They got to go do something that they enjoy doing, because he's just trying to fill their tanks back up at this point. So we're going to have to get creative with how we really do that with people.
Yeah. I think those micro energy savers are super important. We don't realize the thoughts that are running through our head consistently that may be draining that energy reservoir, right? Anxiety, for example. Anxiety is not something that can happen in the present moment. And a lot of people say, well, I'm feeling anxious right now. You're feeling anxious because you're thinking about something that hasn't happened yet, or you're bringing something from the past into the present moment. And that will drain and zap your energy quicker than almost anything else. Because it's constantly running in the background. It's like leaving applications open on your phone. Even if you're not using them, it's draining your battery, whether you realize it or not.
Yes.
Right. And so being able to rewire and reprogram your brain and develop that awareness so you can kind of stop, observe what those thoughts are, where they're coming from, and then offer yourself a solution to that, right? Asking yourself those questions, having that dialogue with yourself.
Yeah. And I think, one of the other interesting things that's draining people's energy, there was probably a couple months ago, Gallup released some interesting studies. And one of them suggested, and it's all around job fit, getting the right people into the right spots, right? Jim Collins made that famous with Good to Great, with get them on the bus, get them on the right seat on the bus. And that was great in theory, but he gave us no way to do that. And that's one of the things our company focuses on, is helping people get good fit in the roles that they have their people in. But Gallup's data suggested that if you spend 20 hours a week having to adapt in your job, you will begin to suffer burnout. So if you spend half your time adapting, in other words, I'm not great with details. If you forced me to spend more than half of my time focused on details in my work, Brittney, you and I probably share a similar situation with details, right? If we had to focus on details 30 hours a week, how quickly would your tank drain?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that getting people in the right roles, having the right functions on their desk of what they're working with, really making sure they're thriving and operating in their sweet spot, helps stop this drain that's happening. And so that's one very practical way to help solve that problem as well.
Yeah. And it all starts with asking questions and having that dialogue. Like, I cannot preach that enough. I mean, EOS does the same thing, right? Right people in the right seats. And I know a lot of people that hate what they're doing, or they love what they do, but they hate the task that's been assigned to them, but they're afraid to speak up and tell their manager because they don't want to lose the project. They don't want to be demoted. They don't want to be moved to another team.
Yeah.
But their skills, what they're great at, is not being fully utilized. It's being shifted into something that takes them more, like you said, time, energy, effort, because it's not their specialty.
That's right. I'll give you a good example of that conversation. We had a client not long ago that we helped, the software that we use helped him set a job target. And so he set this job target for this position, and he looked at the person's data that he had in the position, and he had this aha moment of like, I'm expecting her to do things that are not consistent with who she is. So we suggested he sit down and have a conversation about that with her and start to identify what are those things you do every day, those tasks that are in this bucket, and what are the ones that are in this bucket, because this bucket can stay, but we're going to move this bucket somewhere else and find other stuff. And there was such relief in this lady that he was having the conversation with, that she actually opened up and said, I was within a week of giving you 2 weeks notice because I couldn't take it anymore. Right. So again, on our end, the data raised awareness for the leader that he had a problem in this particular situation, and it gave him the confidence to go have a conversation that was not drama related.
Yeah.
It was very factual, and here's what I'm seeing. What are you feeling because of that? And she was able to open up and say, yeah, I was planning on leaving.
I think another problem that we're dealing with now is leaders not being open to flexibility. You know, that plays a huge role in engagement. Now that people are going back into the office, some people love it. Some people wish they were back at home. And in fact, my friend went back into the office and he was like, I am more productive at home. It shows in my numbers. Like, I can actually show proof that I do better at home, because when I feel tired and I need to take a 15-minute refresher nap, at home I can do that. At the office, I can't do that. So it takes me twice as long to complete something than if I were at home.
Right.
And I don't know, let me ask you this. Why do you think, even though a lot of leaders will say, I need the data, you need to show me proof, there is proof about this stuff. Why do you think so many people are still so resistant even when there is data?
Well, I think for a couple of reasons. One, because there's conflicting data, because there are studies that are coming out that's saying it's also not productive. Somebody just put in the chat trust, which is a big issue, right? If the trust doesn't exist, it's hard for me as the leader to kind of let you go. I think what I hear from some leaders is a real concern that our adjustment in all of this is going to be to swing the pendulum too far, when the pendulum should really be at a balanced place. And oftentimes we do that in society, right? We go from one extreme to the other trying to fix a problem, and eventually it'll settle where it needs to settle, right? And so what we counsel our clients on is there's 3 types of interactions that we need to be having with our employees. One of them is transactional, and that's the one everyone's talking about. That's the work. I can still get my work done. That's the transactional part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's 2 other components. One is relational. How do we still have the relational component to our work? Because Brittney, we're talking about these conversations that need to happen. Well, those don't happen easily if they're, 1, not in person, 2, if there aren't high levels of trust. And oftentimes they're like in the moment, like something happens and we're walking down the hallway, we come out of a meeting, there's an opportunity to have a discussion. And so we take away the environment for that to happen to really maintain those relational conversations. And then the third conversation is developmental. Okay, how do I really communicate effectively what my expectations are? How do I give and receive feedback more effectively? And it's not that that can't be done virtually, it can. It's just we're all not real good at doing that yet either. And so most of the studies that have been done around the transactional impact of, can I get my work done or not get my work done? Do I do it better or not as well? And we're still not measuring the other components, and we won't for a period of time until that starts to hurt. And then we'll kind of go, wait a minute here, we got to rethink this. And I think the other thing we have to remember is we had remote workers long before COVID. I spent 10 years as a national sales manager and had 25 people throughout the country dealing with the very same issues we're talking about right now. And how do you maintain that relationship? How do you have those conversations when these people are not right next door? So it's not really all that new either. And then lastly, I'll say also, the employee wants the right to determine the work environment, but what right does the organization have to set the course for how it wants to do business? Right? So there has to be this balance even between the two, because we work with a lot of manufacturing companies. Go talk to that person working 8 hours a day on the manufacturing line about working from home. It's not even an option for that person.
Right.
Police officers, physicians, firefighters, they don't get to work from home. There's a whole segment of our society where this is just a non-conversation because it's not even an option. So there's a very small subset that we're actually talking about when you think about it.
That's true. I want to talk a little bit more. You're talking about the relationships in person. I don't necessarily disagree with you. However, I will say that I know a lot of people who said, now that I'm back in office, I still don't talk to those people. I still don't hang out with those people.
Right.
I see them in meetings and that's that. For people who had good relationships that maybe started a team amid working remotely, their relationships grew very strongly, even virtually, and are just as strong now that they're back in the office. But I feel like you kind of already have to have that relationship built with someone for it to thrive in any environment, right? Just going back to in the office doesn't change that relationship. And as someone who is, and I'm just speaking for myself and other people that I know are very introverted, I feel more comfortable having that conversation, those hard conversations virtually instead of in person, because I may be fidgeting, you can only see so much of me, right? I may be fidgeting under the table. I may try to refrain from doing that if I'm in person, depending on the situation. I feel more comfortable being able to disconnect from the computer afterwards and just take a big, deep breath and go for a walk. Whereas if I'm having that challenging conversation in person, I may not be able to do that. I may have to go right back to my desk and work and power through it. So I think, like you said, that whole pendulum, right?
Right.
We've got to figure out what works for each person instead of trying to blanket strategies, solutions, etc.
And that's why we developed this concept of leading to the one, because it fits into that perfectly. If I lead you and Chuck and you're on my team, that may work for you, but it may not for Chuck. So it's my responsibility to understand that and go, you know what, Chuck prefers in person and Brittney prefers something on Zoom. So I'll communicate in a way that's more comfortable for that person in that situation. And you raised a really good point, and that is proximity does not guarantee that these conversations will take place. But I know that for somebody like me, proximity sure helps, because I prefer to have those conversations in person. And so without proximity, it makes it more difficult for me.
Yeah. And that's the
But
thing.
there is no
It's
one size
not,
fits all.
yeah, exactly.
It's just
110%.
and we're going to try and make it that, and it's just not. I know people that cannot stand working at home. I think about some of these families that had 2 people working from home while their kids were trying to do school from home. I don't know how they managed that. My wife and I would not have survived that with 4 kids at home trying to do that. I can't even imagine the chaos of what people went through during the COVID lockdowns and how they even managed all of that and navigated it. But Brittney, I think one of the things that you would agree with too is all of the things that we've talked about today and really getting this unlocked thing. None of us ever figure that out on our own, do we?
Right.
We need help, and people need mentors. They need coaches. They need advisors. They need people to help them navigate, because it's not simple and there is no one size fits all. And so maybe take a second and kind of talk about that for you. What's that look like? And even what does Convo look like?
Yeah. When I started my business, I was facilitating and I was talking all the time, which was great. I love to inform, but I realized it wasn't really getting anybody a return, right? Because there wasn't that follow through. And so after doing a few programs and workshops and one-on-one coaching, I created CONVOshop because I saw a need for conversation. Instead of talking at someone, let's talk with people. Let's solve problems together, because that's where innovation, creativity, and clarity comes from. Let's develop that awareness together. And so with CONVOshop, in the beginning, it's kind of like a boot camp, so to speak. So it starts off with 3 main components: an introduction to emotional intelligence, but on a very deep level. We're not just going to talk about the 5 elements. We're really going to talk about how that applies to your life, how you work, how you engage, how you interact, and why you may be hesitant to move forward, right? And have these difficult conversations. And then that leads directly into deconstruct to reconstruct, rewiring all the programming to where we are open, we are curious, we are excited to solve these problems instead of fearful and hesitant and have our walls up, right? And trying to point the finger at everyone else. And we don't feel like the finger is being pointed at us when we are able to work together on these things. And then the third component, and I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but the locus of the locus of control. And that has to do with our internal control and external control. And then how do we influence others? Once we solve all of that, we have a phenomenal foundation to build upon. And that's where I see you guys integrate, what you guys do with the data, bringing that in and incorporating that with CONVOshop. So as we go through the sessions and solve people problems, that they can use that data to effectively communicate and navigate the situation. It helps with that context, as you were talking about, not just content. And so in the sessions following the boot camp, CONVOshop would be 90-minute sessions once a month. We focus on one major problem that all of us are focused on or working through, and then we reverse engineer it. We start with the problem. We look at each of the elements of emotional intelligence and say, where is this breaking? And where can we solve through that to overcome these people problems that we're facing? We're not going to put Band-Aids on things anymore.
That's right. That's great.
We're doing some serious surgery with fast recovery, hopefully. Yeah. So if any of you guys that are on the call If that resonates with you, if you want to have another conversation and learn more, feel free to direct message myself or to direct message Bob, and we can get together and have a conversation about how that may be effective for your organization or teams. And I really want to focus on mid-level managers. I want to throw that out there because CONVOshop isn't specifically for mid-level managers, but this, I guess, first round that I'm doing is very focused on all mid-level managers, because I hear so often from employees that, oh, my manager, but that manager likely came from their position. They were never provided the training that they needed to be a leader. But the beautiful thing about mid-level managers is they also touch the top. So they have an immense impact and influence on that organization, which is why I want to start with mid-level managers.
Yeah. Well, Brittney, I know that it's been fun to get to know you and to hear your story and your journey. It really is an amazing journey for those who haven't heard it. And it's really exciting to see even this happen in the midst of kind of your growth and progression and where you're at now. So I just want to commend you for your heart and the work that you do, your care for people. It just shows, you know, when the very first time we met you, we could see that this was a person that deeply cared about helping other people really become everything they were created to be. So thank you for the work that you do.
No,
really
thank
appreciate you.
I'm so grateful for you and for Chuck and for Andy. I mean, you guys are great. Thank you so much.